Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for taking time out to come to our lunchtime seminar on poverty and the cost of living crisis and the role of social work. So a recent report, the Runnymede Trust, talked about the cost of living as a social emergency, and there's no doubt that this is adding to inequalities experienced by individuals, families and communities who were, many of them already living on the edge of poverty. So for this lunchtime seminar, we have invited a range of speakers to discuss really the multi-dimensional impact of poverty and the current cost of living crisis, and to consider how we got here, what we can do, both as individual social workers and as professionals to address the issues. So we're really going to explore the role of social work, a relationship-based and value-based profession. We're concerned with upholding human rights, with social justice, principles of equality and inclusion. Those are all within our Social Care Council conduct and practice codes. So we're going to also explore, revisit the anti-poverty practice framework for Northern Ireland. So we're really lucky to have a great range of speakers. Please do put questions in the chat box and take time to discuss this at the end. So we hope we'll have time at the end. So and we're hoping this will really provide you with a lot of practical information, research information, lived experience as well. So we're going to start. We're very fortunate to have Professor Anne-Marie Gray, who's Professor of Social Policy at the University of Ulster. She's also co-director of ARC, which is the Access Research Knowledge, a joint University of Ulster and Queen's Research Centre. She's chair of Youth Action Northern Ireland and currently chair of the UK Social Policy Association. So over to you, Anne-Marie.
Thanks very much, Mandy, and thanks everyone for coming along today. I've really been looking forward to this. So I'm just going to get back to the start here of this presentation. So hopefully everyone can see that now on their screen. It's great. I'm obviously not a social worker, but I'm really interested in social work and social care. So I'm really glad to be here. And particularly given that just in the past year, we have been doing some work on poverty in the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey, which is run by the ARC Research Centre. So Alison had asked me just to provide some context for today's discussion. And I thought a good thing to start off by saying would be that we are, of course, very preoccupied by the current cost of living crisis and by the fallout from COVID, and that will continue, I think, for some years. But I do think we need to remember that many of the challenges that we're facing with regard to poverty have really just been exacerbated by these crises. And one, I think, of the challenges that as professionals and as policymakers we do need to address is the fact that many of these factors are very historical, and are very structural. So things like low pay in Northern Ireland, the real persistence of educational inequalities, persistently high rates of economic inactivity going back decades, and then our very poor social structure, particularly with regard to childcare and with regard to social care. And so I think for all of those reasons, the rising inflation has had a more negative impact in Northern Ireland than in other parts of the UK. Although we don't have the highest poverty rates in the UK, I think some of these current things are definitely having a much stronger impact here. So just in the past year, we published findings from the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey on attitudes to poverty and social security in Northern Ireland. Really interesting because it's the first time that we've run a module of questions like this in the survey, the first time the Northern Ireland public have been asked about these issues. And I'm not going to go through all of the data here, but I do provide a link for a research update, which we did on the findings, just for people who might want to read about it in more detail. But just to say that the fieldwork for the survey was carried out in advance of the most substantive increases in energy costs and so on. And even with that, they provide a really worrying baseline in respect of the health of the financial health of the Northern Ireland population. So, as I said, the survey took place during the final quarter of 2021, but they do show that a significant minority of households really struggle financially, and that has increased since the start of the pandemic. Oh, I'm just having a bit of trouble putting this on. We asked people, first of all, about how they coped with the financial hardship they experienced. And I don't think these findings are really unexpected, but they do point to a very strong reliance on family and friends, first and foremost, and then on increasing debt, either from credit cards, banks or credit unions, or from other more risky lenders. Now, the Women's Support Network also published research in March of 2022, drawing attention to the amount of borrowing from family, but also from illegal money lending and from paramilitaries. And that's also been addressed in other Ulster University research. And I think it is really important to highlight that borrowing from family and friends, because the extent to which that is sustainable as more people have come under financial pressure. I wanted to flag up a specific particular aspect of the survey, and we asked people about their ability to cope with an unexpected expense, because I think that can tell us quite a lot. We selected a figure of £500 because we thought that would represent, a domestic expense like a new washing machine or something like that. And what we found was that a quarter of all respondents said that they wouldn't be able to afford an expense like that. And you can see the figures there, it's particularly in actually the younger age groups, the 18 to 24 and the 25 to 34 year old age groups. We found that there was less than a 2 percentage point of difference between the ability of people in paid employment and those who are not to afford such an expense. And then we asked specifically about whether people had to turn their heating down or to turn it off because they couldn't afford the costs, and that was in the previous winter. So when costs were much less than in the winter that we're currently in. And we said that were they doing that even though it was cold? And again, we're finding nearly a quarter of households saying that they were turning their heating down or off due to costs. And again, the age group is very similar. And we thought that was particularly concerning, given that in that age group is where we're likely to find families with younger children. And then half of respondents who described themselves as low income had turned their heating down or off because of the inability to afford it. So we shouldn't really, I think, be surprised by any of this, although it was really good to get the evidence. The Family Resources Survey, the last survey, which was completed pre-COVID, found that 36% of households in Northern Ireland have no savings, so they don't have a safety net. Nor should we really be surprised by the small amount of difference between the ability of those in paid employment or not in employment to afford such expense, because again, the official statistics show us that there's very significant numbers of people in paid employment living objectively in poverty. So then in terms of the current cost of living increases, we do have some evidence to show that Northern Ireland households are being disproportionately impacted. So I've just selected here the findings from the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, and they modelled the impact of the inflationary rises across the UK. And I'm just selecting some of the findings because for time reasons, but the likelihood of households in Northern Ireland falling into destitution, so the most abject form of poverty, was twice the UK average. And then our own Consumer Council in Northern Ireland showing that when inflation reached 10.1%, the lowest earning households in Northern Ireland were left with just £29 per week after essential bills and costs. and finding also that 30% of households in Northern Ireland are living in fuel poverty. Something I think which is attracting much more attention, and I think will come up in some of the other talks, is this issue in Northern Ireland of housing affordability and of homelessness. Now, of course, the context for that is changing tenure over a number of decades, much less social housing, particularly housing executive housing, and a very strong growing reliance on the private rented sector. So, you know, there are specific issues here, I think, for Northern Ireland. Those changes have meant more here, I think, than in other parts of the UK, given that historically we did have quite a strong housing executive sector. So the change has been to private sector renting has been more rapid here. It's also concerning because of I guess the lack of a policy framework for really expanding social housing provision in Northern Ireland. We do have a draft housing supply strategy at the moment, but of course, in the absence of a government, that there'd be no movement on that, and that draft strategy also has limitations. But one of the most significant issues, of course, has been housing benefit changes, and particularly alongside increases in rents in the private rented sector. And the latest figure from the Ulster University property people who chart this on a quarterly basis show that rents have been growing up, private sector rents have been going up pretty much everywhere in Northern Ireland, and that's a continuance of a trend. So if you see in the bottom left-hand side of the slide there, that shows you the average rent by property type. So these really hefty rents. And that's a problem, because that the housing benefit really doesn't match that level of rent for people who are depending on support with their rent. And that's a big cause of housing insecurity in Northern Ireland. So the actual shortfall in rents is in the region of £119 per month. So that means that for those tenants who are requiring that support, they have to find that money then from their disposable income, or they fall into arrears. Now, we found this to be a problem in research that we did for the Simon community on hidden homelessness in Northern Ireland, where people were just unable to pay their rent and were moving into accommodation with relatives or friends, you know, usually fairly insecure accommodation. We found also that it's a problem in terms of people being concerned about that insecurity. So people who are living in hostels or who are living in bed and breakfast accommodation, including with children, were saying that they were holding out for a housing executive house because they saw, looking into the future, they felt the rents would be more affordable and the tenancy would be more secure. I did want to spend a minute or two saying something about our social infrastructure, and particularly our care infrastructure. So we're currently the only region of the United Kingdom, the only jurisdiction not to have a childcare strategy. It is kind of rather depressing whenever I think back over my working life and childcare being one of the things that worked on, to find that we're still in this position. So we've had no real equivalent to the expansion of childcare provision and support with childcare costs that has taken place in England, Scotland, or Wales. And that has a clear link to the high rate of female economic inactivity that we have. And that, of course, then has implications for female poverty. And we look at the number of single parent households in poverty, most of those headed by women. It's another indicator of that. But in the area of social care and care of adult members of the family, I think there's an issue here, and there's also an issue for the social care workforce, which is a very gendered workforce. So we see these social care systems under pressure. Certainly with regard to social care, there's a workforce crisis, which is linked to issues of pay, difficulty with progression, the lack of a proper qualifications framework. So we know what these problems are. We know that they're affecting recruitment and retention. But I think the overall problem is that as a society, and certainly governments have failed to see care as economically valuable, so they haven't invested in it. The UK Women's Budget Group has done some really good economic analysis of the value of the social care sector to the economy, which really contests that argument that it's not economically valuable. And in Northern Ireland, with colleagues in the Ulster Business School, as part of a gender budgeting project, we did an economic analysis of investment in apprenticeships in Northern Ireland at every level. We found that investment is very gendered, but we found that there is virtually no investment really in social care, in the social care workforce, despite the fact that it's been identified by government as one of the growth areas for the economy, and despite the fact that there is this workforce crisis. We actually talked to the Department of the Economy about this and about the potential for apprenticeships, and they were very clear that that's not something they were considering, that they see it as a Department of Health issue. And we did talk to the Department of Health, and I think obviously policymakers there see the problems, understand the problems, see the solutions. But they were agreeing that this is really an issue for the Department for the Economy. It is a workforce issue more generally, and a training and progression issue more generally. So I didn't want to end on a depressing note, because I think there is scope for improvement, albeit that we're in this difficult situation regarding our political institutions. But in the latter part of the last Assembly mandate, the Minister for Communities had commissioned a number of independent reviews, both of welfare reform mitigations and of the discretionary support scheme. Now, both of these provide really focused and really costed recommendations, and some of them are very much in line with what the Scottish Government is doing regarding support for families, support for carers, and so on, and the continuance of the mitigations. We also had a lot of work being done within the Department for Communities on a number of equality strategies: the anti-poverty strategy, an equality strategy, a disability and a sexual orientation strategy. And all of these strategies contained recommendations around the need to alleviate poverty. And the expert panel report, which was prepared for the anti-poverty strategy, note that the purpose of that strategy should be to raise living standards and to reduce living costs for those below an agreed objectively defined poverty line. So I think it is, the collapse of the institutions has meant that there's been no real progress in terms of the publications of these yet. They're absolutely pivotal, I think, to improvements, and a lot of work has gone into them. We've been waiting a very long time on a fuel poverty strategy. We do now have a draft homelessness strategy, which I think is a foundation, but I think there's a question mark about, whether we need to go further there. One thing in addressing our shortfall in social housing is, of course, supply, building more houses, but also whether we should be protecting the stock that we have. So both Scotland and Wales have ended the right to buy, and that has been argued to have had an impact on their statutory homelessness figures. On a really positive note, I think what we found in the Northern Ireland Life and Time survey is that public opinion in Northern Ireland understands that poverty is a problem. And we found really strong support for the idea that the social security system should enable people to live a life of dignity. And the vast majority of respondents, regardless of the political party that they said they supported, felt that the Northern Ireland governments had not been doing enough to address poverty. And the reason why I mention that is I think it is really important for any government to understand that there is public support for particular policies. And I think very often the narrative in the media and so on will be that poverty is still this old idea that poverty is willful, that it's feckless and so on. But I think the public attitude surveys like this provide really valuable evidence to the contrary. So hopefully I've kept Alison and Mandy kind of within the time, so I will stop there and look forward to the discussion later.
That's great, Anne-Marie, thank you.
Anne-Marie, thank you very much. And yeah, please do put questions in for Anne-Marie. I'm going to, much as I'd like to comment on it, I'm going to keep moving because I know we have a lot of speakers to get through. So our next speaker is Darren Strawbridge, and Darren is a professional social work officer within the Office of Social Services at the Department of Health. So his role is to promote the quality of social work and social care services, to provide social work advice to the chief social worker, to government departments, agencies and the statutory and voluntary sector on the formulation of policy and operational procedures. And Darren's going to really revisit and talk to us about the anti-poverty practice framework, which was published by the Office of Social Services in 2018 as part of the Reflections series for social workers. So Darren, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Mandy. Can you see my slides okay?
Mm-hmm.
That's good. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for having me, Mandy, for today. So as you can see, the title is Anti-Poverty Practice Framework for social work in Northern Ireland, and this was one of the first documents in relation to a reflection series that's been completed by the Department of Health. And the reflection series was a reflection series of good practice and papers developed by the Office of Social Services, and it was helped to talk about just social work and social care practice in Northern Ireland. They're themed around social work practice in a continuum, and each reflection looks at different dimensions of social work. It's about sharing examples of good practice and kind of promoting this as a topic for social work and social work students as they come into practice, and inviting us as social workers and social work students to reflect on our practice as we go forward. So it was really important. So when this was first developed, this framework, it was developed in 2018, and it was warned at that time that poverty was the elephant in the room in social work practice. And based on what Anne has just said and the information she's just provided, I think we can all agree that it is no longer the elephant in the room. And I think the diagram illustrates that, given what we know since 2018 to now and post-pandemic, I think it's very clear that, us as social workers and social work students and others, it's not the elephant in the room. So the Anti-Poverty Framework for Social Work in Northern Ireland, what does it seek to do? So the framework seeks to bring poverty into the foreground of social work practice. It aims to help social workers recognise and respond to the impact of poverty on individuals, families and communities. We know that poverty is a major social injustice. Mandy spoke about it earlier. Social work as a profession is committed to social justice, and it must work to tackle poverty, whether it's people with mental health problems, people with a disability, carers, children or families across the entire spectrum. The purpose of social work is to improve and safeguard social well-being, and tackling poverty must be central to that aim, and I think everyone would agree in relation to that. So what is poverty? I mean, there are many definitions of poverty, but I mean, obviously, Age UK, I thought this one was quite good whenever I talked about when a person's resources are not enough to meet their basic needs and allow them to take part in society. This could mean struggling to cover food and energy bills, watching every penny spent, worrying that nothing is set aside for some emergency, such as a cooker breaking down, or being unable to afford the cost of transport needed to visit a friend. Again, Anne gave us some really, really important statistics in relation to this during her presentation there now, and I think this just feeds into connecting that to what she was saying. While it is useful for social workers to understand the various definitions, it is not suggested that social workers need to measure or define individual poverty levels. Self-reporting social work observation and assessment skills are always sufficient to prompt social workers to think about anti-poverty practice. So just a wee bit of a statistic. When I was doing some research in relation to being asked to this, I mean, I just thought it was really important to get some really, really up-to-date kind of research, or just a one paragraph. So I was looking at the Joseph Rowntree. He's provided some really significant research in the past and currently. So as Northern Ireland entered into the pandemic, nearly 1 in 5 people in Northern Ireland lived in poverty, including over 100,000 children. With 1 in 14 households in food insecurity, the recent spike in energy prices and wider inflation, as well as certain areas of Northern Ireland, groups such as peoples in workless families, disabled people, carers, and people in ethnic minorities having much higher poverty rates across Northern Ireland. And I don't think that's going to come as any surprise to anybody whenever you see that. And I would encourage people to look at that in 2022, Joseph Rowntree report. It's actually very, very good, and would provide you some really interesting statistics and some really good information in relation to the current situation under the research that they've done. So look, I mean, if I've just put in some, I think it's really important we highlight some quotes. And it just says, this is one by Nelson Mandela, and it's overcoming poverty isn't a gesture of charity, it is an act of justice. And I think it's important we all kind of reflect on that and kind of take that forward in our everyday practice. So why should social workers be concerned with poverty? Because social workers committed to social justice, and it's about social injustice. Social work's purpose is to improve the lives of people that work with and their social well-being, and tackling poverty at every level, essential to enhancing social well-being. Social work works with systems and understands the systemic nature of poverty, which is created by structure and societal inequalities. And you can see there it's about victim blaming narratives of poverty and making sure that we look at that in its entirety. So on the back of that, it's just important, another wee quote: no matter how difficult it is to reach people who are negatively perceived and excluded, and as possible. And I think we should always keep that at the forefront of our mind and our practice when we consider the things that we do to tackle poverty. So the impact of poverty, which is far-reaching and wide, and this is just some of the things that I've put down in relation to it, and these are contained within the wider anti-poverty framework. And I will encourage you all to continue to look at this as a relevant document in terms of promoting the work that social workers, social work students, and others can do to tackle poverty in their everyday practice. So poverty increases the risk of mental health problems and can be both a causal factor and a consequence of mental ill health. People with a disability are more likely than people without to be disadvantaged in multiple aspects of life. They're more likely to be unemployed, gain fewer qualifications, receive lower pay, and face higher living costs. Approximately 2.1 million informal carers are in poverty in the UK. People living in poverty are more likely to experience crime. Poverty, if combined with other stressors, can lead to an increase in the likelihood of someone committing crime. Children are more likely to be living in poverty than the general population. And people from ethnic minority backgrounds experience inequality and can face specific problems in terms of finding suitable employment, housing, education, and health. And they, for me, were just some of the most striking factors around the impact that poverty can have on people's lives, and across all ages and across all areas. And I just thought it was really important to kind of hit those messages home in terms of the actual impact. So response to poverty. As part of the anti-poverty framework, there was a wide stakeholder engagement in relation to having steering group members, but also other people as well too, and having that co-production aspect. Because we feel that's really important, that co-production aspect of responding to poverty and having people's lived experience in relation to that. So this was just one of the quotes I thought was really, really, really good and really helpful. So when you're in poverty, it's important to feel you're a valued member of the community. If you feel your opinions matter and your voice is important to someone out there, you will constantly grow and evolve. And there's a number of quotes in that in relation to that, but I thought that was one that stands out when we think about response to poverty. So what can social workers do? A lot. It is very important that we as social work practitioners think about poverty and the impact it may have on those we support. We need to understand it, and it's important, as always in social work practice, that we understand it at the individual and at the wider societal level. That will not come as any shock when we think about Thompson and the anti-oppressive practice aspect of social work. It is also extremely important that our responses to poverty are well informed. Our responses to poverty should be co-produced, as I've recently talked about, and those who experience poverty, and we must be careful not to impose our own narratives of poverty or solutions on other people. Poverty-aware practice belongs across the whole social work practice continuum, from prevention to care and control. Anti-poverty practice should be embedded in routine processes such as assessment, planning and review, and they are the core kind of functions of social work practice. So some of the examples, it's easy to say that, but some of the examples, and I wanted to kind of relate it directly to practice and what we do when we intervene. And these are just some of the examples that I thought about when I was doing up this presentation, when we think about anti-poverty, when we think of impact, and we think of our response. So we can advocate with housing, social security services about entitlements for service users, providing Article 18 for children and Article 15 payments for adults in terms of cash grants or urgent food supplies. Think about CARES cash grants whenever we complete CARES assessments for those we work with. And these are some of the initiatives that are out there at the moment under the CARES and Direct Payments Act. Referring to local charities, offering advice to those who want to take up employment, and supporting and promoting community empowerment. Now, they are just a few of a very wide list that social workers and social work students can start to think about and do in our everyday practice. So in conclusion, the framework wishes to support those to feel empowered to tackle poverty, and that social workers are able to address those discriminations about racism, disability discriminations. As you can see, social workers who are engaged in poverty in a multi-layered way can have a significant sphere of influence. Social workers should respond to poverty in the context of anti-oppressive practice and be able to challenge those for a more equitable society. So what do you think about as you go forward today, or just think about or reflect as you go on through the seminar is, can I ask you to begin about the things that you could do within your own practice in relation to challenging and intervening for those who experience poverty? And that is me.
Thank you, Darren.
Thank you very much, Mandy.
And again, do put your questions in, and hopefully you all have access to copies of the anti-poverty framework. So our next speaker is Peter Bryson, and Peter Bryson is head of Save the Children, head of service Save the Children in Northern Ireland, and he really leads the charity's work supporting young children living in poverty by improving their early learning, delivering innovative programmes, and advocating for change that will make a lasting difference to children's lives in Northern Ireland and around the world. So Peter has a wealth of experience in research internationally and in the UK, hugely qualified, but the bit that I would like to emphasise is that he's also a social worker by background. So Peter, I'm going to hand over to you, and I know you're going to talk about specific research with families in Northern Ireland that would be really interested to hear about.
Thanks, Mandy, for that introduction. I hope everybody can see my screen. Yeah, full confession, I was a social worker, started off in residential units back in the day. I went into casework, so I feel as if I'm coming home slightly in this audience. My presentation echoes a lot of what you've already heard, and thanks to Anne-Marie and to Darren in terms of their inputs. But I'm going to firstly focus on the human component here in terms of lived experience, whatever that means. It's one of those words or terms that we use, but this is about human beings, their reality, what they say as experts in their own lives. And we, in Save the Children, fully believe that there's an absence, certainly in the research context in Northern Ireland, focusing on what actually people feel and think and experience in terms of the welfare system, social security. And before we get into It's Hard to Survive as a research project that we carried out last year, a couple of reflections just at the top of it. Anne-Marie mentioned context. Context is everything in terms of how you reflect on your practice, how you engage with individuals in their lives, and how you make a positive contribution. Within the last 10 years, reflections in terms of Northern Ireland, the welfare system, particularly social security, has gone through a massive amount of change. Universal credit has come in. And within that, there is a context with a political philosophy that says that work is the answer to everybody's circumstances. I'm going to be bold and say that that's been discredited. Work isn't the answer. Poverty, in terms of the number of children, over 100,000 children in Northern Ireland, has been stubbornly resistant in terms of dropping those numbers over time. There is something about poverty being with us and our acceptance of an acceptable level of poverty. And for us in Save the Children, it's completely unacceptable that 1 in 4 of our children live in poverty or are impacted by poverty, with all we know in terms of developmental stages of childhood and what poverty does in terms of long-term outcomes for children and families. This research is part of work that we've been doing on an ongoing basis for over 10 years alongside the social security system in terms of trying to get that voice into policy making. And try to get the context broadened. Anne-Marie mentioned public attitudes. I'm really concerned about public attitudes because we're living within a context where either people feel that there's always someone worse off than themselves, particularly guilty in Northern Ireland of thinking that way, or that poverty in itself is something that we don't really fully appreciate or understand, or maybe we're slightly bored with, to be quite provocative about it. And within that context, which is a personal opinion, JRF gave a definition of poverty. Darren's offered you a couple. I'm going to give you another one in terms of your own reflections. And what JRF says, the essence of being in poverty is that your resources don't sufficiently meet your needs, and that needs are defined with reference to the society that you live in. And I think what's important about that definition is it actually challenges all of us to think about the society that we want to live in, the origins of the welfare state, and actually what it aimed to do. It's interesting within the pandemic that we're very defensive about our NHS, rightly so. But when we come to social security and welfare support, there's a wide variety of quite negative and quite detrimental attitudes out there that we need to fight on a consistent basis. On individual practice level, the context of how you engage with families needs to be informed with regard to the context that they're living in. And hopefully this research will give you a wee bit of information in terms of what we've found in the current circumstances. So the research is called It's Hard to Survive, and it's about experiences of the welfare system and the cost of living crisis currently in Northern Ireland. There we go. I need to go back, sorry. We'll go back to the start, excuse me. Apologies for that. So just to pick up, what we did a rapid evidence review and identified a gap in terms of lived experience and voices of families contributing to policy. The aim was to bridge that gap and to start with a bit of primary small-scale research. We engaged with 24 families across Northern Ireland between May and June on the basis of that, and published a first stage report, It's Hard to Survive, in October of 2022. This is live, and we're moving to a stage now where we've gone back to the families in terms of grounding our findings, referring back to them, checking with them in terms of the relevance and accuracy of those findings, and getting their suggestions in terms of what this means for policy development. So again, this is about them being experts in their own lives and them being empowered to make statements about what they want to see the future being in terms of policy development. It's often very easy to criticize the system and stay in that position, but what we want to have is a stance where we're actively involving people in policy development. So going into this year, we will begin continuing with a range of focus groups with the hope of doing a second stage report in June about policy solutions that could be taken forward to government in terms of that lived experience component and what we've found in terms of the research. In terms of the research, we talked to 23 mothers. Again, the gendered nature of poverty in terms of the detrimental impact on particularly women as primary carers is reflected within this research. 2 fathers were involved. Of those 23 mothers, 13 were single parents, which again replicates a lot of the statistics in terms of single parents being particularly impacted by the welfare system. 11 were in 2-parent households. There was an average of 3 children. Although we did talk to one family that had 10 children. And again, that speaks to the peculiarities of Northern Ireland in terms of demographics, but we have larger families within this context as opposed to other contexts. And we went down to the youngest child being 6 months old. There were 6 households that had adult children living with them. So again, just age references. So that's the people that we talk to. The main points arising from the research thematically, or the first is that all the families told us that the welfare system is not enough in terms of answering their expenditure as opposed to what they receive in terms of welfare benefits. And there were statements within this in terms of, in reflection to the context, it's not just about the current context of the COVID pandemic or the cost of living crisis. It's something that they'll live with over time. And the families that we spoke to had all been in receipt of benefits for a number of years. So the cost of living crisis, in contrast to the narrative that's out there, these families were saying, yeah, it's amplified things that already existed for us. The second theme was one size doesn't fit all in terms of the system. In particular, a lack of empathy within the system, the move to universal credit, the use of new technology in terms of access to services was for some families, particularly younger women, was something that was useful to them. But for the majority, there was a lack of empathy in terms of the human component, in terms of actually relating to their individual circumstances, their context. And what we saw in the research is that for most of the families that we talked to, their circumstances change, if not on a daily basis or weekly basis, with regard to things, surprises in terms of their income and expenditure. So however sophisticated they are in their budgeting, in terms of planning forward for their family to do the best for their family, something can come in, something can break, a cost can come in, a debt needs to be paid, that they need to speak to somebody about in terms of how they supplement their income and provide for their children. Again, well-worn narratives about putting food on the table or heating the home. But in some circumstances, for families, this lack of empathy is compounding. It's something that is a weekly experience for them and is erosive. And that leads to the third thematic area in terms of whether the welfare system is harming people or helping people. And the lack of empathy in terms of stress in the family home, when you're constantly thinking about where money is going to come from for essentials. Over years, within the experience of the families that we talk to, has a compounding and detrimental effect on their mental health, their ability to cope, their ability to do the best thing that they want to do for their child. And without exception, in the families that we talk to, all of the parents want to do the best for their children. And that's relative. It's not only your individual experience, it's also looking at other people and within the wider context of society in terms of what is normal and seeing that you are not normal. That's not a healthy headspace to be in. And the last one is passing responsibility. The deficiencies of the welfare system for the families that we talked to, they told us about how they needed additional help from non-governmental, charity, voluntary organisations in terms of their access to welfare support, but also navigating the system, how they relied on extended family or friends in terms of topping up or giving them loans, as opposed to going to loan sharks within communities. And it's compounding in terms of this is not just about individuals, families and children, it's actually groupings of people within particular communities that the lack of adequate welfare support actually makes a lot of people's lives harder. So those are the main points in terms of the four thematic areas that we drew from the people that we talked to. Just to go into a wee bit more detail on that, in terms of the theme of it's not enough. People have been tied on benefits, but they've managed on those benefits. At the minute, it's particularly tight. The cuts in benefits and the transfer to universal credit has made things more difficult. And the COVID pandemic, in terms of some of the moves, welcome moves that the government made, like the £20 uplift, was helpful, but didn't make a huge difference. So that's a bit of a check for charities such as ourselves, who campaigned for the maintenance of the universal credit uplift. Actually, families, what we're saying was it's useful, but it didn't actually solve the problem that they've got, which is income and expenditure not matching. And it's no surprise that over the last year or so, the compounding impact of the cost of living crisis, everything's going up. So everything's amplified for people who were getting it tight in the past. Incomes, a lot of the families they worked who did part-time work were actually in employment. There's a lot of profile around the number of people slipping into poverty who are actually working. But in terms of incomes, wages and benefits, they've stayed the same or reduced over the time period that we talk to people. So nothing is improving for people. A lot of the families are trying to save, they're trying to forward plan, they're trying to change their circumstances. But at the minute, it's very, very hard to conceive of a reality where you have any reserve at all. That figure of £29 per week after costs for families is real. And it means that families stay in the same circumstances, which again speaks to the stress and the pressure that that puts on families in terms of not being able to change their circumstances. Just some quotes, I'll leave you to reflect on these. We asked one parent, Robert, who was in the Northwest, how does he find budgeting? After he stopped laughing about it, he said, we do our best. It's very, very difficult. And he doesn't know really how to answer that question. And all of the families talked in great detail about the complexity of budgeting on a weekly and monthly basis within the current universal benefit system. Some families day to day are making budget adjustments, and that's a huge pressure on their lives. Some more quotes here, and it demonstrates the stress that people feel. I worry, especially having a daughter, I want to give her the best for everything, and it's impossible. So people are just getting to a stage of ultimate frustration in terms of changing their circumstances. Moving on, in terms of the theme of one size doesn't fit all, each family is different and they have complicated lives. There's common challenges within the families that we talk to, but there's also individual circumstances that the lack of empathy within the system doesn't appreciate. So long-term health conditions, disabilities, mental health issues, or being a single parent compounds the experience of poverty, deepens that experience of poverty for families, and further isolates those individuals from our definition, which is about having equitable access to what's normal in society. Families told us that the welfare system isn't flexible, doesn't offer a personal service. So it's oppositional to their needs. It doesn't hear what they're saying. And there's something about the social security system, welfare system has lost its ability to listen to people. That human component is not there. It's transactional in terms of the way that it's set up, particularly the universal credit system and the changes that were implied in that. For many people, things went wrong, and that meant there was extra challenges and that caused problems. And I'll speak a bit specifically about that in terms of how things knock on for families. So the smallest thing can have the biggest impact in a family's life. And there was just acknowledgement of there was a combination of people aren't relying solely on welfare support, they are working. And the nature of work in terms of shift work, there's no consistency to that pattern of work. So people's incomes go up and down. So therefore that contributes to the inability to plan.
Peter, a few minutes.
Surely, I'll zip through. I just want to talk to that knock-on impact in terms of one experience of Fia here, in terms of the individual nature of it. Fia's a mother of 5. She's got anxiety and depression. We assume we've all got access to new technology. She doesn't. She asked her brother to help. She asked from local family, but she got into debt and struggled to manage that debt on an ongoing basis. But the focus of that is her inability to speak to somebody in terms of getting individual support in a timely manner for her. So harming rather than helping. There was administrative errors in terms of common experience that families thought that the system can amend, and we'll be feeding back on that. The design of the system doesn't work for people, and it makes people's lives more complicated was the summary in terms of harming rather than helping. Again, a lot of quotes here, particular reference to parents in terms of childcare arrangements and the inability of the system when you're paying in advance for creche, that you don't get universal credit payments in advance, so you cannot plan your budget on a regular basis. Summer is a particular pressure for families in terms of being able to pay for childminding and creche arrangements for their families. We're going to zip on. Show you the passing responsibility aspect of it is not only do we know a lot about debt and people falling into debt, but the wider impact within communities and the reliance on charities. And there's a question for us in terms of being a charity. We offer emergency grants alongside many other people. Are we supplementing the inadequacy of the system? And that begs a question in terms of our advocacy component about policy change and the position that we hold as a charity. We need to do more in terms of making the system work rather than supplementing the inadequacies of it. Some just quotes here. Thank God for the hostel. They have food banks, they have food, and there's people in there. That human component in terms of being able to engage with people who are actually doing the best for you is not serviced by the welfare system. Another example here, Daisy, single mother with one child, living in a rural area. She was in care. She's now in a master's degree. She's got to pay for travel. Her son has autism. It's really essential for her to have a car and not rely on public transport because of his dietary condition and his inability to get on the bus. She's got a student loan. These are all pressures. She found the system okay, but in terms of her circumstances and her ability to get flexibility within the system, it's not really adding up for her, and she needs to rely on other people. I'll sum up just in terms of, there's a lot of detail within this report. If you want to access the full report, our intentionality here is to speak truth to power in terms of lived experience, to give that to government in terms of a contribution to policy going forward. But what people are telling us at this stage, without getting to a proposal level, is that the system can change. We have a new system, and there is a contribution that families who live within that circumstance of affording themselves a welfare can contribute in terms of making amendments to that system. So we want to have a positive stance on this, but we also want to highlight the fact that we're not doing enough to engage with people with experience and gain from their knowledge and expertise of what it means to live within welfare. So I hope that's useful. I hope it's useful for your practice in terms of your reflections and context. And thanks for your time today.
Peter, thank you very much. That is really useful. As I hopefully we'll have some time for discussion at the end, and what you're saying really feeds into what we've heard from the other presenters as well. So our next presenter is Kevin Higgins, and Kevin is Head of Policy for Advice NI. So he's worked in the advice sector in Northern Ireland for over 30 years, including time with CAB and the Law Centre. And Advice NI is an umbrella organisation for the independent advice network in Northern Ireland. So, and they deal with over 250,000 inquiries a year. So a large part of Kevin's work involves addressing social policy issues, responding to consultations, and he's currently an independent member of the Department for Communities Northern Ireland Joint Standards Committee. So I'm going to hand over to Kevin to talk about the work of Advice NI.
Hi, thank you very much, Mandy. Thanks for the invitation to talk, and thank you to the previous speakers as well. Actually, really interesting. So thanks everybody for that. I know I have two speakers coming after me, so actually I will, before I even, I've got the usual slide deck or whatever, but my reflection is that I reflected on what's my purpose in this presentation here, this lunchtime, and I know there's lots of really good information. And if I can, I'll start with the last line that I was going to say to you, and maybe it's, from my point of view, it's maybe the most important, which is actually we need to strengthen the links between social work and independent advice services. I think previous speakers have set out really clearly, you know, the evidence-based needs that are out there and the experiences that people are going through in terms of just not having an adequate amount of money to live on, to pay the bills, keep a roof over their head, and so on. And Could I just start with something that happened before the holidays? It was on the Wednesday before Christmas. I know lots of services were winding down and so on. Got a call from one of the MLA offices to say, we've got this woman has got in touch with us. She's at her wit's end, doesn't know what to do, literally no money, can't heat home. Could you try and do something? Could you try and pick this case up and see what might be done? And it was coming near the end of the day on the Wednesday. So what I did was, like, first of all, the first thing to do was give the lady a ring. Obviously very emotional and very distraught state. So the first bit is about gaining the trust and going through all of that. And then we got to the point where we could have a bit of a coherent conversation, and it was about her income had suddenly gone away down, and she wasn't completely clear on why that had happened. She thought it might have been something to do with their child's DLA. And that was about all. That was just the mental broadband of this lady. And she was a single parent, few children, and then she had other grown-up children living in the house, some going to uni and so on. But that was the broadband had maxed out, the bandwidth had maxed out at that point or whatever. Something had happened to her income. So first things first, and we have contacts with the department, and we got onto the DLA, obviously Ask for Children. And we were able to see that because of this lady's complex life and lots of things that happened in the past months, the child DLA had stopped because she hadn't returned a renewal form. The child had turned 8 or 10 or something. It triggered a DLA form, but it hadn't been returned. So the first thing I'd asked that manager was, this lady is in a terrible distraught state. I mean, you obviously must have safeguarding measures within the department. So have you triggered those? This lady is not in a good place. And so what he committed to do was work with us to see if we can't get this turned around. And he did. To be fair to the manager in DLA, he rang me back to say, if we can get this form out to the local advice service, can you get the advisor to get that form completed with the lady, scan it into your system and email it back, which we did in the same day. So that happened on the Thursday. And so what we were able to do is we were able to address that particular problem that she presented with. But when we went through the whole case, there were eye-watering deductions to do with loans that she'd got out and various advances and various things. So again, we got in touch with the debt centre unit, and we were able to get deductions of about 60, 70, 80 pounds down to 15 pounds. So again, it's all about maximising incomes and give people a toehold in life, if you like, or whatever, to give people a fighting chance. So we got those deductions pulled away down. The DLA subsequently come back to us again later on the Thursday to say, yep, everything's in place. We'll put this award back in place, which meant we could get our carers allowance back in place. So we got the premiums and all back on our universal credit. And Peter was talking about universal credit there. It can seem like a monolith that you simply can't get at as well too. So we managed to get that sorted. And then, like, you can always do more. Got in touch with discretionary support, got some grants flowing for this lady just coming up to Christmas so that she could use that money for however she wanted to, for the dignity of the family, presents for children, put oil in the tank and so on. And I know the local advice service was able to access a local council fund, again, for presents and again to heat the home and to put food on the table over Christmas. So again, back to the last line I was going to say, which is about, stronger links between independent advice services and social work. Why should there be stronger links? It's because we have advice, and I'm not saying this is advice and I do all of this good work. It's the independent advice network. We have got advisors and advice and I on the helplines. We've got our face-to-face advisors out across all the council areas. I'm not saying we want to take over the world, and I'm not saying everybody else doesn't do great work. It's all needed and everybody does do great work. But if we can plug in on certain complex areas that we know can really harm people because it leads to reduced income, and then if we can plug in and work together to redress and turn that boat around and actually maximize incomes, let people feel that they've been listened to, feel that they're empowered. If this happens again, that lady hopefully has a roadmap out of this or whatever. So that's how I wanted to start with this. And if I know they were just past 5, I'll just take 2 more minutes and I'll stop at whatever slide is the most relevant to all of this. You know about Advice NI. Please go onto our website, adviceni.net, and you'll see all the work that Advice NI do and the members do, the statistics and all of that. We put all our policy work on the policy section. So please do go onto the website and you'll see all of this information. No need for me to go through it now. A bit of homework for people to do if you want to, but a lot of work is done, and it's on benefits and debt and money and employment, housing. We have generalists that soak up all of that good stuff, and then we have specialists that deal with specific issues that people have problems with. For example, our EUS team, in terms of people from abroad and asylum and status and all the rest of it. There's a list of all the organisations, but you'll find them on adviceni.net. That's right. And why is independent advice so important? It can be barriers for people going directly to government, things like stigma, things like fear and trust. But what's going to happen to me? Will my children be taken away? For instance, that lady there, she could have all, and it's whatever the person's fear is. You might think, oh, that fear is unfounded, but if the person has the fear, they have the fear, and that's the end of the story. Ability to challenge decisions. We get stuck into the department almost on a daily basis. But just to say, when I came back from New Year's on the Tuesday, the 3rd of January or whatever it was, I made a point of doing an email to the permanent secretary to say, listen, here were your 2 managers in DLA, children's, and in discretionary support, who turned around payments to this lady in like an hour. And I think things like that need to be acknowledged as well. Good work needs to be acknowledged, because then people will build confidence on that. It'll be shared around colleagues, and we can all kick and we can all highlight the bad experiences. But if we can flag and highlight the good experiences, hopefully all staff then will be tripping over each other to do their own bit of good work as well, so that then by all of that, we can get better services to people, and obviously a confidential quality services based on dignity and respect. Cost of living crisis, it's all there, and I think all the speakers have previously gone through all of that. The big one for me on that page is about eroding resilience. People out there just have very little or no resilience left after all that has happened to them with the decade of austerity. Various good things have happened, and I would focus on the NI response there, that I never fall into this trap that we can't do anything. At an individual level, I've just said that we can do brilliant things on an individual level. At a Northern Ireland-wide level, we can do brilliant things as well. We have the Everson mitigations that got us a start on things like, the benefit cap and the bedroom tax. And then we got those through the cliff edge, and loads of work being done. We got those extended, and never underestimate that. And loads of other stuff like the child funeral fund, period poverty, the food boxes. We can and must and should and will hopefully do much better in terms of local responses. And we've done it in the past, and we should be doing it again. What's needed at a UK government? Like, we need adequate levels of income, and people have touched on that already. It was such a fight to get benefit uprating in line with inflation. I mean, it's accepted now, but back in September, there was no guarantee we were going to get 10.1%. There was talk of the 5.1% or whatever it was. But in any case, we didn't get the 10.1 for the current year. So people are falling behind, even with 10.1 for social security benefits for the year ahead. But again, I've highlighted things that we can be doing, and people talked about the review of discretionary support, the review of the mitigations by Grania and by Les. This stuff, and those reports are all published, the recommendations. We just need legislation. We need the Assembly doing what they do best to get the legislation through, to provide the help to the people that need it. So, I mean, again, at 10 past, I'll give other speakers a chance, but please visit adviceni.net. Please let's strengthen the links between your services and independent advice services. Thank you.
Kevin, thank you, and I appreciate that you ran through that a bit for us, but the slides will be available, and I think even that one slide that shows the reach and breadth of the organisations that are part of Advice NI. So social workers here work all over Northern Ireland, and they'll not be too far away from an Advice NI organisation. So just bear that in mind. So the next person that I'm going to move on to is Anne Mallon. So Anne Mallon is a carer to her daughter Kelly. She's also co-chair of the Northern Ireland Social Care Council Participation Partnership, and she is chair of the Management Board of Community Advice in Armagh, and also a founding member of Armagh Carers Group. And she also works with her local St Vincent de Paul group. So a lot of experiences both as a carer and as a real community activist. So Anne, I'm going to hand over to you.
Okay, Mandy, thank you. I don't have any slides because myself and technology have only a very passing acquaintanceship. So as Mandy said, I'm a carer for my daughter, who is now 44. She took a brain virus when she was just 11 weeks old and has been left very severely disabled. But let me even go back to before the pandemic and before the cost of living crisis. Carers even back then, and when I talk about carers, I mean family unpaid carers. Carers have always been at a disadvantage because of their inability to go out to work, because of their caring responsibilities, and because of lack of social care in the community. So they're mostly dependent on benefits or on low income jobs because they have to work around their caring responsibilities. As a result of this, carers, particularly older carers like myself, develop health problems themselves, and physical health problems, mental health problems, social isolation. And this is particularly prevalent in rural areas. Rural areas suffer more from social isolation, and statistics show that it costs more to look after a person with a disability than to provide for someone in the general population. I think one of our previous speakers said there were 2.1 million carers living in poverty in the UK. So that shows you what the statistics are for that. So the person we are caring for sometimes is immobile, so they need more heat to keep them warm. The cost of transport, taking the person with the disability to appointments, picking up prescriptions, maintaining a car, putting petrol in it, all that sort of thing, all adds to the carer's responsibility. And again, this is more prevalent in rural areas. And most carers do it because the person that they're looking after is related to them, because they love that person. They have a responsibility to provide a roof over the head of that person and a reasonable standard of living. And there's also interaction with social services for carers sometimes can be very difficult. One of the previous speakers talked about carers cash grants. Well, in the area that I'm from, carers cash grants are mostly passed on from carer to carer by word of mouth, rather than from a social worker or a key worker in that area. And a lot of people don't know what a carer's cash grant is, know that even they're entitled to one or that they can have one. There seems to be this sometimes fear among social workers and key workers. If you pass on too much information, people will be looking too much. But that's not really what unpaid carers are about. So I have a few notes written down here, so I'm going to keep referring to them. And also, carers are finding it more difficult to even engage in social activities that they would have engaged in before, because the cost of getting to them, the cost of participating in them, and this in return then impacts on their mental health. It increases their social isolation and adds to their loneliness. And so it's like a vicious circle. And then if they stay at home, they're using heat and all the rest of it. So and sometimes carers have to make very difficult choices, just the same as everybody else, but it's sort of magnified because they can't do anything else about it, and they have the responsibility of looking after the person who needs the care. And there's a great lack also of sometimes of community care, where there's no support there to back the carer up. And some carers like myself are fortunate that they have a lot of family support, and you know, they can, I mean, I can shout fairly loud if I do need anything, but there would be carers who wouldn't be in that same situation, and they're the ones that sometimes fall through the net. But the main description of a carer in this scenario is unpaid. I mean, some people confuse unpaid family carers with carers who come in to provide domiciliary care into your home. So the impact of the cost of living is magnified a lot of percentages for carers who are looking after somebody there's the extra cost, the extra heat that's needed. I mean, I can't turn the heat down in my house because my daughter sits in a chair all day. When she's out, she's in a wheelchair. And so therefore the house has to be like a furnace. Otherwise, you know, she wouldn't be able to survive in it. She has very little movement and, you know, needs all her personal care done for her. She needs spoon fed. She needs all that sort of thing, even at 44 years of age. And so the impact of this cost of living is impacting a lot on carers. I would be the founding member of Armagh Carers Group, and every month when we meet, we you know, all I'm hearing is you know, talk about, well, I spent so much, I got a fill of oil and now I've nothing left for whatever else they have to buy, maybe get the brakes fixed on their car or everything else. And so the impact, and I think maybe that social workers have to become aware of that. I mean, most social workers are very good and, you know, very empathetic to carers' needs. But until you're in that situation yourself, you don't sort of realize just the impact that it has. I mean, older carers like myself, I mean, I need the heat for myself as well because I have severe osteoarthritis and rheumatoid arthritis. And that's just years and years of caring, 44 years of caring and lifting and handling and all that sort of thing, and having all that anxiety. Am I going to have enough for to keep this house going? Am I going to have enough for to make sure that my daughter has the best quality of life that she's entitled to? And that's more or less all that I have to say. I didn't want to take up too much of your time, and I'm not one for ad-libbing very much anyway. So so that's my presentation.
And thank you so much, and you did brilliantly, and you really got across exactly the concerns and worries that carers have at the moment. And I think, you know, very much as well as social workers, we need to be thinking about, you know, we're relationship based and actually taking time with carers to really understand what day-to-day life is like because of poverty at the moment. So and thank you so much. Our last and not least speaker is Andy McClenaghan, and he's a BASWA Public Affairs Policy and Communication Lead. So he's going to talk about BASWA's campaign for change, including the recent Crushed by the Cost of Living campaign in Northern Ireland. And I'd also say that Andy produces and hosts a number of podcasts called Let's Talk Social Work, so worth dipping into those as well. So I'm going to hand over to Andy.
Right. Hi, everyone. This is the home stretch. Yes, I'm Andy McClenaghan. I work for BASWA Northern Ireland. I'm going to talk a bit about the campaigning work which BASWA Northern Ireland has done over the last number of years in relation to anti-poverty activity, and I'm going to take about 10 minutes to do that. In terms of the sort of the UK context that, you know, that's affecting us over the last, we're all aware of the decade of austerity, 2010 to 2019. During that time, £30 billion in spending reductions were made to welfare payments, housing subsidies and social services across the UK. Huge impact. I mean, the most recent Joseph Rowntree Foundation stats that I can get for UK indicate that there's 14.5 million people in poverty in the United Kingdom. That is over a fifth of the population. In Northern Ireland, JRF's most recent stats show that we've got 330,000 people in poverty, 18% of the population, but those came before the cost of living crisis, and they will have got worse. In terms of the impacts that social workers are seeing day to day, that you guys will all be seeing as you're working with service users, you know, poverty impacts limits life opportunities, exacerbates a wide array of social problems, you know, including addiction, mental ill health, and neglect. We know, for example, that mental health problems are more prevalent in deprived areas. Department of Health stats indicate that 33% of people living in our most deprived areas could have a mental health problem. And that's 10 percentage points higher than for people living in our least deprived areas. Those figures also indicate that lower levels of life satisfaction, higher levels of long-standing illness, and increased likelihood of loneliness among people living in our most deprived areas. NISRA's statistics on death by suicide also indicate higher suicide rates in the most deprived areas of Northern Ireland. They're approximately 2 times higher than the countrywide average and 3 times higher than in our least deprived areas. You'll be familiar with research published, the Child Welfare Inequalities Project. Queen's University were involved in that. In 2017, they published research indicating that children living in our most deprived areas of Northern Ireland are 6 times more likely to be placed on the Child Protection Register and 4 times more likely to become looked after by social services than those in the least deprived areas. Now, the costs associated with that are absolutely enormous. There's the huge human costs, but there's also the financial costs. So looking at the costs of taking children into care, the average cost of a foster care placement is £24,000 per year. The average cost of keeping a child in residential care is £265,000 per year. Costs are huge. The number of children in care are the highest on record as well. There's now 3,702 children in care, and that compares to a pre-COVID rate of 3,362. It's a 30% increase over the last decade and a 50% increase over the last 20 years. So, massive, massive impacts associated with poverty. I'm going to flip on just for speed. In Northern Ireland, we have social security entirely devolved to the Northern Ireland Assembly. We have responsibility for our social security, but we have to fund it from the Northern Ireland Block Grant, which is provided by Westminster. We differ from the UK in that we have interventions, for example, the Welfare Reform Mitigation Package, which I know Kevin was very closely involved with when it was introduced in 2016. As part of the Fresh Start Agreement, there was £585 million committed over 4 years to fund the Welfare Mitigations Package. And that meant that since 2016, people of Northern Ireland have been protected from a range of social security cuts, including the bedroom tax and the benefit cap. But the package that was put in place, it was a time-bound package. It was due to run out in March 2020. And that meant that households who were benefiting, they faced a complete loss of their protection, essentially a cliff edge in terms of the provision. So in 2018, colleagues from 2 charities, the Law Centre Northern Ireland and Housing Rights, convened what became known as the Cliff Edge Coalition. BASWA Northern Ireland have been part of that coalition. We're part of the steering group that's directed the work. There's now over 100 organisations involved in Cliff Edge. And since 2018, we've been campaigning for the permanent extension of the Welfare Reform Mitigations Package. So I'm just going to have to, because my notes have gone a bit funny, I'm just trying to check where I am. Yes. Okay. So working together as part of the Cliff Edge Coalition has been really, really helpful. We are one body. We all have a voice, and we can raise them individually or we can raise them collectively. And working together as part of the Cliff Edge Coalition has been massively significant. So back in 2018, we agreed the following aims for the coalition's work. 1, to extend the welfare reform mitigations against the impacts of the bedroom tax and the benefit cap beyond March 2020. And secondly, to strengthen the package to address the 2-child limit, the 5-week wait for universal credit, and provide assistance for private renters. Now, the 2-child limit, that applies to universal credit. It also applies to families that are in receipt of child tax credit. Having a clear message was really, really vital. From the outset, we presented the problem. We were able to set it in context in terms of who and how many people were being affected. And we were also able to outline what needed to change. So I was looking back over some of our former briefings, looking back to 2020, we were highlighting that up to 1,500 families were affected by the benefit cap, and they would lose an average of £168 per month if the welfare mitigations ended. And 34,000 households affected by the bedroom tax would lose an average of £50 per month. And this was information. There was a huge amount of engagement with MLAs, briefings to the Committee for Communities, meetings with Westminster ministers, and also meetings with all the political parties in Northern Ireland to really highlight the impact that the ending of the welfare reform mitigations would have on people in Northern Ireland. We had an awful lot of political challenges that we came up against. So when we began work as a coalition in 2018, we faced big challenges caused by the lack of an executive. Stormont was not functioning, and when legislation was passed to extend the mitigations package, the executive had actually again collapsed. So in the interim, we were hampered by the fact that we had a Sinn Féin Minister for Communities who was very supportive of the package, and social security was within her ministerial portfolio. But we were opposed by the DUP, who had concerns about the long-term viability of the mitigations. And of course, the legislation required to place the mitigations on a sustainable footing needed cross-party support in the executive. So all of our work and the work of others contribute to the permanent extension of the bedroom tax mitigation via the Welfare Supplementary Payments Act that was introduced in March 2022, just before the Assembly was prorogued prior to the election. And although the benefit cap mitigation was extended by the same legislation, the extension was for 3 years. So this was an incredible outcome, really, really significant, but work still needs to be done to secure a permanent extension for the benefit cap mitigation, and also for the strengthening asks that we're continuing to campaign for. So in the introduction, Mandy mentioned the Crushed by the Cost of Living work. This was a big conference that we held in September 2022. It was Ciara Fitzpatrick from Ulster University and a colleague of mine, Siobhan Harding from Women's Support Network. We were really keen to try to put some pressure on members of the Assembly to highlight the impacts that the cost of living crisis was having on their constituents, in an effort to basically get an executive formed and have some measures introduced to address the problems that people are facing. We call for 4 very clear asks. Peter talked about the universal credit uplift and how that was limited in its impact, and it was, but one of the things we were asking for was to see the reintroduction of the universal credit £20 uplift and its extension to legacy benefits. And we also argued for a one-off payment of £500 to those entitled to disability benefits or carers allowance. We called for the removal of the 2-child limit for universal credit and child tax credit, and we call for an end, to Social Security debt deductions from low-income households as well. We were severely hampered by the fact that we didn't have an executive. All the emergency recommendations required support from an executive. And although we received support from across the political spectrum for many of our asks, one party, crucially, wasn't at the event. And I'll let you guess who that was. It's not hard to work out. My final point, and this is around the importance of making poverty-informed policy in Northern Ireland. It's another key issue that BASW Northern Ireland has been campaigning for. And we want to see an audit of the costs of poverty in terms of all public spending. So in 2016, Joseph Rowntree Foundation published a report called Counting the Cost of UK Poverty. And it found that £1 in every £5 spent on public services in the UK is making up for the way that poverty damages people's lives. And the total cost of poverty in the UK was then around £78 billion per year. So that's impacts in terms of social service provision, health, the long-term health problems, educational underachievement, criminal justice issues, youth justice issues. Poverty has a huge impact in terms of public spending. The expert advisory panel recommendations to the former Communities Minister for an Anti-Poverty Strategy, they also made this recommendation for an audit of the cost of poverty. And it's an ask that BASW supported in our manifesto for social work before the last election, and one that we'll continue to push for, hopefully when we have another executive and the Assembly starts to function again. So that was a bit of a whistle stop tour through what I was trying to home to speak about, but I don't want to keep anyone past time, so I'm going to stop there. Thanks very much for listening.
Andy, thank you so much, and you've brought us in right on time. We did want to have time for discussion, but I think all of the presenters' inputs were so important, and I think it really shows just the kind of cross-cutting issues about poverty, and we could have probably taken another lunchtime seminar. I just wonder, Alison, are there any questions in the chat box, or does anyone want to ask a question before we finish up? We could take an extra 5 or 10 minutes.
Mandy, can I just say one thing before we finish? When I was talking about Cliff Edge Coalition, we met with the Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. I said we met with Westminster Government Ministers, and that was a slip of the tongue as I was racing through. And because it's recorded, I don't want that to go unchecked. Sorry about that.
That's okay, fine. And I would say as well, we've already talked about the Northern Ireland anti-poverty framework, but BASW's anti-poverty practice guide is a great resource as well in terms of practical advice for how social workers should address poverty. So would anyone like to pose a question before we finish, when we have such a great range of presenters with us? Yeah, well, Alison, maybe you want to round off and just confirm about where people can access the recording as well.
So I would just really like to thank everybody for today. We've had a great turnout. I'm hoping that I'll have them on the website by tomorrow. So I'll actually send you the link to the website. Thank you very much. Thank you to our presenters and thank you for attending today.